Settle into a comfortable position and let the breath slow as a gentle journey into the medieval past begins, where the familiar rhythms of daily life stretched across continents and the distant idea of a sacred destination guided countless footsteps. Between the late 11th and 13th centuries, waves of pilgrims and warriors moved from Western Europe toward the Eastern Mediterranean, following routes that wound through the mountains of Anatolia and past the Great Walls of Antioch before turning to the longed-for city of Jerusalem. Imagine yourself among people who viewed the world through a different horizon, who carried both faith and fatigue across arid landscapes, sustained by a hope that often collided with the realities of hunger, illness, and the quiet persistence of the human body under strain. As the voice moves slowly and evenly, the pace will remain unhurried, attentive to simple textures and small details. The scrape of iron rings on cloth, the flat taste of stale bread, the coolness of pre-dawn air along a caravan road that seems to go on without end. Tonight's 4 gentle segments will begin with the grounded experience of marching and surviving as a crusader, then drift to the rise and fall of the Templars, glide through the long-debated mystery of the Shroud of Turin, and finally come to rest in the softer light of a courtly interior, where tapestries, poetry, and wine tempered power with ritual. The purpose is quiet understanding rather than excitement, a measured exploration that acknowledges hardship but lingers on the steady rhythm of lives lived in another age, allowing the mind to wander as sleep draws closer. Imagine yourself stepping into a long column of travelers, iron rings resting on your shoulders, each breath lifting a weighted shirt of mail that presses evenly across chest, arms, and hips with a familiar, patient heaviness. A long-sleeved hauberk of interlinked rings could weigh roughly as much as a packed travel sack, often around 12 kilograms, sometimes more with added coif and chausses, distributed across the body so the burden arrives as a constant, subdued presence rather than a single, sharp strain. The mail shifts with each step, a quiet rasp of metal on padded linen, while the belt at the waist gathers and steadies the load so movement remains possible over hours and then days. Ahead stretches a road that runs across the stony and mountainous stretches of Anatolia, the path rising and falling through dry valleys, where wind lifts dust from the verge and the sun presses a warm hand against the back of your neck. The column advances in measured rhythm, boots, hooves, wheels, only to slow for a broken bridge or quicken across a narrow defile where the line tightens and the sound of leather and iron gathers into a single contained murmur. Water becomes an organizing thought, shaping decisions about when to stop and where to aim the day's march, a quiet calculus formed by heat, terrain, and the slow exhaustion of the body's reserves as thirst outweighs appetite. The rations are plain and predictable: coarse bread hard enough to soften in watered wine, a handful of dried pulses, a small ration of salted meat when available, each mouthful chosen for sustenance rather than pleasure. Traveling supply reached the Levant irregularly in the early decades, and what ships brought, grain, wine, and essentials, could never be counted on as a permanent solution. So the marching army learned to plan around scarcity as a normal condition. In the quiet moments between steps, the mind returns to simple comforts: the cool of morning shade, the relief of a full water skin, the anticipation of evening when boots come off, and the world contracts to the diameter of a small fire. The rhythm of the march gives way to the rhythm of a siege, which is slower, more demanding in patience, and heavy with the weight of constrained choices. Before the immense walls of Antioch, the army settled into a long wait, its numbers insufficient to fully encircle the city, its hopes trained on supply lines that wavered with winter weather and distance. Rains arrived, and with them cold nights, damp bedding, and the discomfort of garments that never quite dried, while the granaries of the besiegers thinned and foraging parties pushed farther outward in disciplined, necessary arcs. In winter, hunger clarified priorities, replacing ornament with essentials, while discipline became a kind of quiet endurance. Less a show of force than a slow refusal to surrender to fatigue. Desertion occurred at the margins when hope narrowed, not in a blaze of drama, but as a private calculation resolved in the dark, the body slipping away over wet ground in search of safer roads. Within the lines, the sick shared space with the well, and common ailments turned serious against a background of poor sanitation, irregular diet, and close quarters, where even simple illness could spread and linger. Contemporary experience and later studies align on a sobering constant. Disease often proved more lethal than combat, the invisible companion of any large camp where cold, hunger, and proximity undermined health. Dysentery became a recurring visitor when food changed suddenly, when men ate quickly after deprivation, or when water was not clean, testing bodies already tired by the long march and the long wait. It is difficult in the calm of evening centuries later to grasp how many lives ended not at the breach in a wall, but in tents and makeshift shelters, attended by friends who could do little more than keep watch. The iron discipline of daily tasks sustained morale, repairing tack, mending hose, reshaping a bent rivet in a loose mail ring so the hauberk remained reliable, preparing the evening meal with care even when ingredients were few. Mail itself offered a reassuring continuity. Its familiar weight acted as a boundary against uncertainty, while the padded garment beneath reduced chafing and softened the mail's quiet scratch to a tolerable whisper. When the wind rose across the plain, men tightened cloaks and huddled near embers, pulling warmth into cramped hands, trading small stories whose details blurred against the long, constant background of waiting. Some nights were clear enough to see the cold stars above the city walls, which held their own small fires in answer, a silent exchange that could last for months as both sides counted time and measured endurance. In this suspended world, the senses learned to cherish the ordinary, the smell of smoke caught in wool, the faint sweetness of wine diluted in water, the relief of dry ground after days of mud and wet straw. When battle did come, it arrived as a compressed interval between longer spans of preparation and recovery, and even then, the ledger of losses did not resolve simply into wounds sustained at the walls. Across medieval armies, disease remained the relentless adversary, eroding strength before and after combat, visiting camps with an impersonal regularity that outlasted the clamor of any single assault. Scholars attempting to measure the First Crusade's toll among nobles and common fighters alike found heavy attrition, with estimates suggesting roughly a third of aristocrats perished, and, in some cases, far higher losses among lesser-ranked crusaders. Numbers are only suggestive across such distances in time, yet they describe a steady drain, a slow arithmetic that continued even in the absence of battle, as bodies met illness, exposure, and the wear of sustained exertion. Marching resumes after a siege, and so the familiar scrape and sway returns, now under warmer skies, with the Levant ahead in pale colors and low hills dotted by groves that promise shade. The line of men, thinner but determined, moves toward Jerusalem, pausing for prayers that set a measured pace to the day and a quiet structure to low spirits. Hunger remains a quiet participant, and on the approach to the city, the army's condition is recorded in gestures of humility, processions in bare feet, a bodily recognition of both scarcity and hope. Reaching the goal does not end the struggle, because famine, disease, and the mechanics of siege continue to govern the daily experience, even as sacred places rise into view. For many, the reality of the Holy Land is a landscape of shortages and hard choices, a place where faith must work alongside supply wagons, carpentry for siege towers, and the slow calculus of wood, rope, and iron. Disillusionment is not a single moment, but a gentle unspooling, a recognition that arrival does not erase the body's needs, and that spiritual purpose shares its space with the plain facts of thirst, bread, and rest. Within all this, armor remains steady, its weight a daily commitment that must be carried as quietly as possible, with straps adjusted and edges checked for wear. A fuller suit, mail for torso and arms, coif for the head and neck, chausses for the legs, could press toward 20 kilograms in some configurations, a number that matters less than the long, continuous act of moving while enclosed in iron. Experienced men distribute the load. They cinch a belt to shift some weight to the hips, they keep the padding smooth under the shoulders, and they learn to turn the body rather than twist against the rings. All of it is practiced, methodical, and intended to preserve energy, a kind of quiet craft developed not for show, but for making one more day of marching possible. At night, in camp, a small circle of light holds back the dark, and the hauberk rests folded near the feet, its surface dull under ash and soot, its rings catching the fire in scattered points. Food tastes better when it is hot, even if it is simple, and voices soften as men lower them out of habit, letting the day pass into a few last words before sleep. Sleep itself becomes a kind of supply, replenishing what hunger cannot, setting the body right for morning when the column rises again and the quiet work of endurance resumes. The march is not a spectacle, but a series of small decisions. How far to go, when to stop, who is strong enough to forage. And beneath these decisions, a steady acceptance that the road is long and the cost is cumulative. In this way, the rhythm of their lives emerges. Iron on cloth, bread in water, hands warming over embers, and the unending line of footfalls carrying hope through a landscape that offers little but requires much. From the worn roads and siege camps of the Crusader experience, attention now shifts to an organized response that emerged from those same conditions, a brotherhood of warrior monks whose discipline transformed them from humble guardians into one of medieval Europe's most powerful institutions. Imagine yourself in the year 1119, standing in the newly conquered city of Jerusalem, where narrow streets still bear the marks of recent conflict, and pilgrims from distant kingdoms arrive in steady, vulnerable streams, seeking holy sites along roads that remain dangerous even after the city's capture. The founding impulse of the Knights Templar arose from this simple, persistent need. Travelers required protection, and the knights who answered this call took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, binding military service to monastic discipline in a combination that was, at the time, unusual and compelling. The early Templars wore simple white mantles marked with a red cross, a visual statement of purpose that signaled both martial readiness and spiritual commitment. And they established their first quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, a location that would lend the order its name and anchor its identity to the sacred geography of Jerusalem. These initial years were modest. A small company of knights living under a strict rule, rising before dawn for prayers, training with sword and lance in the hours that followed, and riding out in small patrols to escort groups of pilgrims across the treacherous stretches between coastal ports and inland shrines. The rhythm of their lives balanced devotion and vigilance. Mass in the morning, bread and water at midday, the maintenance of horses and equipment in the afternoon, evening prayers as light faded, and this structure provided a framework that could be replicated as the order grew, and new members arrived from France, England, and the German lands, drawn by reports of a brotherhood that merged the ideals of knighthood with the sacrifices of monastic life. Papal recognition arrived in 1129 at the Council of Troyes, when the order received formal approval and a written rule largely shaped by Bernard of Clairvaux, whose influential voice lent the Templars legitimacy and helped channel donations from nobles who admired the concept of holy warriors dedicated to the defense of Christendom. With official sanction came resources, land grants in Europe, tithes from estates, and the steady accumulation of properties that required management, record-keeping, and a developing administrative structure to coordinate activities across vast distances. As decades passed, the Templars evolved from a small company of knights into a network of commanderies stretching from Scotland to the Levant, each local house functioning as a node in a larger system that moved not only men and supplies, but also information and increasingly money. The Order's reputation for discipline and integrity made Templars trusted intermediaries, and pilgrims and merchants began to deposit funds at one commandery and withdraw equivalent sums at another, a practice that reduced the dangers of carrying coin on long journeys and quietly laid the groundwork for what would become a sophisticated banking operation. Imagine yourself now in a Templar commandery in the French countryside during the mid-12th century. A fortified complex of stone buildings arranged around a chapel and courtyard, where the daily bell marks the hours of prayer and work, proceeds in orderly sequence. Scribes recording transactions in careful script, stewards overseeing granaries and livestock, blacksmiths repairing tools and armor, and knights training in the yard under the watchful eye of a senior brother. The atmosphere is one of controlled activity, purposeful and measured, with little room for idleness or excess, because the rule governing Templar life prescribed simplicity in dress, diet, and conduct, even as the Order's collective wealth steadily increased. Wealth accumulated not from extravagance, but from careful stewardship and the compounding effect of donations, bequests, and successful estate management across generations. And by the 13th century, the Templars had become financiers to kings, holding deposits, extending loans, and managing treasury functions for monarchs who valued the Order's discretion and reliability. The Paris Temple served as a de facto bank for the French crown, its vaults holding not only Templar assets but also royal revenues, and its officials conducting transactions with a professionalism that reflected decades of experience in handling large sums and complex accounts. This financial power, combined with the Order's independence, answerable only to the Pope, exempt from local taxes and interference, created an institution that sat somewhat apart from the usual hierarchies of feudal Europe, a position that inspired both respect and, in some quarters, quiet resentment. Kings who borrowed from the Templars incurred debts that could not be easily dismissed or deferred, and nobles who saw Templar commanderies thriving on lands that paid no taxes to local lords sometimes questioned the fairness of such privileges, though open criticism remained rare as long as the Order's services remained valuable and its reputation intact. The rhythm of the Order's expansion and consolidation continued through the 12th and into the 13th century, with new recruits swearing solemn oaths in candlelit chapels, veteran knights rotating between European commanderies and eastern fortresses, and a steady flow of correspondence maintaining unity across a sprawling organization that functioned with remarkable coordination given the era's limitations in communication and travel. The Templars developed their own fleet of ships to move men and supplies across the Mediterranean, and their houses served as secure stopping points for diplomats, merchants, and other travelers, embedding the Order deeply into the practical infrastructure of medieval life. Yet the military situation in the Holy Land gradually deteriorated, with Muslim forces reclaiming territory and reducing the Crusader presence to a narrow coastal strip. And by 1291, when Acre fell and the last major Crusader stronghold was lost, the Templars found themselves in an uncomfortable position, an order founded to protect pilgrims and defend the Holy Land, now operating primarily from European bases with its original purpose significantly diminished. The wealth and structure remained, the commanderies and banking operations continued to function efficiently, but the justification that had once seemed so clear, warriors of Christ defending sacred sites, no longer matched the visible reality of an order that appeared to outside observers more concerned with administration and finance than with active crusading. Into this uncertain moment stepped King Philip IV of France, a monarch burdened by debts, facing fiscal pressures from prolonged conflicts, and keenly aware that the Templars held significant assets within his realm, while remaining largely outside his direct control. Philip's calculations mixed financial need with political ambition, and he began to see the order not as an ally, but as a potential target. A wealthy institution whose independence could be reframed as arrogance, and whose secrecy, necessary for banking and military operations, could be twisted into suspicion of heresy and misconduct. The blow came with sudden, coordinated force on Friday, October 13th, 1307, when royal officials acting on sealed orders arrested Templars across France in a single sweep, seizing knights, sergeants and officials from their commanderies and placing them in custody before they could organize resistance or destroy records. The charges read out were grave and disturbing: denial of Christ, desecration of the cross, idol worship, and immoral conduct during secret initiation rites, accusations designed to shock and horrify, to transform the image of the Templars from holy warriors into heretics deserving punishment. Torture followed arrest with grim inevitability, as authorities applied pressure to extract confessions, and under duress, facing the strappado, the rack, and the burning of feet. Many Templars admitted to some or all of the charges, their statements recorded by notaries and presented as evidence of the order's corruption. The detached observer, centuries removed, recognizes the coerced nature of these confessions. But in the moment, within the context of medieval justice, where torture was an accepted tool of investigation, the admissions carried weight and fed the narrative Philip sought to construct. Pope Clement V, caught between the French king's pressure and his own doubts about the charges, initially resisted but eventually yielded, issuing orders for Templars to be arrested throughout Christendom and appointing commissions to investigate the accusations. The trials unfolded slowly, with testimonies gathered, debates conducted, and the legal machinery of the Church grinding through a process that stretched over years, during which imprisoned Templars lived in uncertainty, some maintaining their innocence, others repeating coerced confessions, and a few dying in captivity from illness or despair. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne, Pope Clement formally dissolved the Order of the Knights Templar, not by judicial verdict of heresy, which would have required definitive proof, but by papal decree citing the order's damaged reputation and the impossibility of continuing its mission under such a cloud of suspicion. The properties of the Templars were officially transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, though in practice much was absorbed by the French crown or retained by local rulers who moved quickly to claim what they could. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, had spent years in prison, and in March 1314 he was brought before a public assembly in Paris, where he was expected to repeat his confession and accept a sentence of life imprisonment. Instead, in a moment of unexpected defiance, de Molay recanted, declaring his innocence and the innocence of the order, a proclamation that disrupted the carefully managed proceedings and sealed his fate. That same day, without further trial, Philip ordered de Molay and another Templar leader burned at the stake on a small island in the Seine, and as evening fell, the flames consumed the old Grand Master, whose final words, according to later accounts, included a summons for both the king and the pope to meet him before God's judgment within the year, a detail that entered legend when both Philip and Clement did indeed die within months, lending the story a resonance that has persisted across centuries. The rhythm of the order's existence, prayers at dawn, training in the yard, careful management of accounts, the quiet accumulation of trust and resources, ended not in battle, but in cells and courtrooms, and finally in fire, a dissolution imposed from above that scattered the remaining Templars and left their properties divided among rival claimants. Some former members found refuge in other military orders. Some returned to secular life, and some disappeared into obscurity, carrying their memories of a brotherhood that had, for nearly 2 centuries, represented a distinctive fusion of faith, discipline, and pragmatic power. The legacy remains contested. Were the Templars innocent victims of a cynical king's greed, or had the order's wealth and secrecy bred genuine corruption? The balance of evidence suggests the former, that the charges were largely fabricated or grotesquely exaggerated to serve Philip's purposes, but the question can never be fully resolved because the records are incomplete, the testimonies coerced, and the truth obscured by layers of political maneuvering and later myth-making. What remains clear, across the distance of centuries, is the pattern, an institution born from idealism, shaped by discipline, enlarged by success, and destroyed when its power made it vulnerable to a ruler who saw opportunity in its wealth and independence. The Templars' rise followed the careful, cumulative rhythm of small decisions repeated over generations, vows taken, donations accepted, accounts balanced, reputation nurtured, and their fall came swiftly, a coordinated strike that severed the order from its roots and left only fragments and questions in its wake. From the fate of a powerful order, attention now drifts to a quieter enigma, a length of linen cloth bearing the faint sepia image of a man, front and back, resting in a climate-controlled case in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, where it has resided since 1578, and where it continues to draw pilgrims, scientists, and skeptics in roughly equal measure. Imagine yourself standing before this relic, 14 feet of ancient fabric, woven in a herringbone twill pattern, its surface marked by symmetrical scorch marks and water stains from a fire that occurred centuries ago, and bearing at its center the shadowy outline of a crucified figure whose features emerge most clearly, not in direct viewing, but in photographic negative. A discovery that would not come until the age of cameras. The image itself is subtle, almost ghostly in its natural state, rendered in gradations of yellowed fiber against the cream background of aged linen, showing a bearded man with long hair, hands crossed over the groin, bearing marks consistent with crucifixion, wounds at the wrists and feet, a side wound, and numerous small injuries across the body that might correspond to scourging. For those who approach with faith, the shroud represents tangible evidence of Christ's death and resurrection, a burial cloth miraculously imprinted with the image of Jesus at the moment of rising, while for those who approach with skepticism, it presents as a medieval forgery, perhaps painted or otherwise artificially created to serve as a devotional object, or even as a means to attract pilgrims and their donations to a small church. The documented history begins not in 1st century Jerusalem, but in mid-14th century France, when the cloth appeared in the possession of Geoffroy de Charny, a knight who endowed a small collegiate church in the village of Lirey around 1353. How Charny acquired the shroud remains unknown. No records survive to explain its provenance before his ownership. And when the cloth was first exhibited around 1355, it immediately attracted both devotion and controversy. Nicole Oresme, the respected Bishop of Lisieux and a scholar known for his careful, impartial approach to questions of belief, denounced the shroud as a forgery around 1370, stating that it had been made by clergymen for the purpose of generating revenue for their churches, a charge that reflected the practical economics of relic veneration in an age when pilgrims brought offerings and when miracles could translate into material support. The controversy intensified in 1389 when Pierre d'Arcis, Bishop of Troyes, who held jurisdiction over the church at Lirey, wrote a lengthy memorandum to the Pope declaring the shroud a forgery and claiming that a previous bishop, Henri de Poitiers, had identified the very artist who had painted it. The papal response was measured. Anti-Pope Clement VII, recognized in France during the Western Schism, issued a bull allowing the canons of Lyrae to continue exhibiting the shroud, provided they clearly stated it was an artistic representation of the Passion of Jesus and not a true relic, a compromise that acknowledged doubt while permitting devotion to continue. Imagine yourself in that small church in Lyrae, candles casting warm light on stone walls, the faithful gathered to view the cloth displayed above the altar, some kneeling in prayer, others pressing forward for a closer look, while the clergy carefully explain, in accordance with the papal directive, that what they see is an image, a representation, not necessarily the authentic burial cloth of Christ. Yet the ambiguity itself held power, because even a representation could inspire contemplation, and the human tendency to see what one hopes to see meant that many visitors likely departed, believing they had been in the presence of something more than paint on fabric. The shroud's journey continued through the tumult of the 100 Years' War, when Marguerite de Charny, granddaughter of the knight who had endowed the church, took possession of the cloth and exhibited it in traveling shows, moving from town to town, before eventually selling it to Louis, Duke of Savoy, in 1453, an act that led to her excommunication for disregarding the rights of the canons of Lyrae. Under the House of Savoy, the shroud became a treasured possession, a palladium of the dynasty, kept first in Chambéry, the Savoyard capital, where in 1532 a fire damaged the silver reliquary and sent molten metal through the folded layers of cloth, leaving the distinctive pattern of symmetrical burn holes and scorch marks that remain visible today. Papal attitudes shifted over time. Where early authorities had expressed caution or outright skepticism, later popes from Julius II onward took the shroud's authenticity for granted, authorizing its veneration as a true relic of Jesus and encouraging devotion to the image as a mirror of the gospel. The rhythm of the shroud's life settled into long periods of quiet storage, punctuated by rare public exhibitions, each viewing a carefully orchestrated event that drew crowds and renewed interest, as at the marriage of Prince Umberto in 1931, or the 400th anniversary of the cloth's arrival in Turin in 1978. The modern chapter began in 1898, when Secondo Pia, an amateur photographer, was permitted to photograph the shroud during an exhibition, and when he developed his glass plates in the darkroom, he discovered something extraordinary. The image on the cloth, which appeared as a faint positive in natural viewing, revealed itself as a remarkably detailed negative in photographic reversal, with light and dark reversed to show a more realistic and anatomically coherent representation of a human face and body. This photographic negative effect, the fact that a supposed medieval forger would have created a negative image centuries before the invention of photography, struck many as evidence that the shroud could not be a simple painting. Because how would a 14th century artist have conceived of such a technique, and why would they bother when viewers would not have the means to perceive the full effect? Scientific interest intensified, and in 1988, the Vatican permitted small samples of the shroud to be subjected to radiocarbon dating, with fragments sent to 3 independent laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona, each using accelerator mass spectrometry to determine the age of the linen. The results, published later that year, converged with striking consistency. The cloth dated to between 1260 and 1390, placing its creation squarely in the medieval period, precisely the time frame when the shroud first appeared in the historical record at Lyrae. For many, this seemed to settle the question. The shroud was a medieval artifact, not an ancient relic, but the debate did not end there, because questions arose about the samples tested, with some researchers suggesting that the fragments might have been taken from a medieval repair patch rather than from the original cloth, or that centuries of handling, fire damage, smoke exposure, and bacterial contamination might have skewed the carbon dating results toward a more recent date. New studies emerged claiming to find evidence of contamination or attempting to reanalyze the data with different statistical methods. though the original laboratories maintained confidence in their procedures and results. The image formation process itself remains unexplained, a puzzle that neither painting nor simple contact methods seem to adequately account for, because the image exists only on the topmost fibers of the cloth, with no evidence of paint, dye, or pigment binding medium penetrating into the weave, and the coloration appears to result from a kind of oxidative degradation or scorch-like effect on the linen itself. Forensic analysts have noted that the bloodstains, tested and confirmed as real human blood of type AB, appear to have been applied to the cloth before the body image, a sequence that would be consistent with a burial scenario, but difficult to explain if the entire shroud were a deliberate forgery. Yet the anatomical accuracy is not perfect. The proportions of the body are slightly elongated, and certain details seem inconsistent with what one would expect from direct contact with a wrapped corpse, leading some to propose mechanisms involving radiation, electrical discharge, or other speculative processes that might have created the image at a distance rather than through direct touch. Imagine yourself in a laboratory, bent over a microscope, examining individual fibers from the shroud, noting the yellowing of cellulose, the absence of pigment granules, the way the image seems to exist as a surface phenomenon only, and feeling the tension between what can be measured and what remains stubbornly mysterious. The debate continues in academic journals, at conferences, and in popular media, with each new analysis prompting responses, critiques, and counter-analyses, a scientific conversation that mirrors the theological divide between those who see the shroud as a precious link to the historical Jesus and those who view it as a fascinating example of medieval religious art or pious fraud. Popes in recent decades have approached the shroud with a kind of careful reverence that neither demands belief nor dismisses devotion. John Paul II called it a mirror of the gospel. Benedict XVI arranged a public display in 2010, and Francis made a pilgrimage to see it in 2015, each offering respect for the object's spiritual significance while leaving the question of authenticity open to individual conscience and ongoing investigation. The rhythm of the shroud's existence now alternates between the silence of its protective case, where temperature and humidity are carefully controlled to slow the inevitable decay of ancient fibers, and the rare moments of public exhibition when thousands pass before it, some in prayer, some in curiosity, some hoping for answers that the cloth, despite all the attention it has received, has never quite provided. What remains, after centuries of debate, is the image itself, quiet, enigmatic, neither fully explained nor fully dismissed. A surface bearing the shadow of a man whose identity, whether divine or merely human, continues to invite contemplation, analysis, and the kind of patient uncertainty that allows both faith and doubt to coexist without resolution. As this segment settles and the mystery of the shroud fades into the background, attention will turn from questions of authenticity and science to the tangible, well-documented world of medieval courtly life, where Eleanor of Aquitaine presided over a sophisticated culture of troubadours, elaborate rituals of courtly love, and political intrigue conducted in chambers warmed by tapestries and the glow of fine wines. From the mysteries of a sacred cloth, the focus now shifts to the vibrant, well-documented world of Eleanor of Aquitaine's court, where power was exercised not only through armies and alliances, but also through the careful choreography of manners, poetry, and the elaborate rituals that transformed raw authority into something more refined and deliberately beautiful. Imagine yourself in the great hall of a castle in Poitiers during the 1160s and 1170s, when Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, Queen of France through her first marriage, and Queen of England through her second, presided over what would become one of the most celebrated courts of the medieval period, a place where troubadours gathered, where the codes of courtly love were debated and refined, and where the business of governance unfolded, alongside performances of music and poetry. The walls are hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and biblical narratives, their colors still rich in the firelight, deep blues from woad, brilliant reds from madder and kermes, greens from a careful mixture of yellow and blue dyes, each panel representing months of skilled labor by weavers who translated cartoons into woven images thread by careful thread. The tapestries serve multiple purposes. They insulate stone walls against winter cold, they display wealth and taste, and they create spaces within spaces, dividing the Great Hall into more intimate areas where conversation can occur with a degree of privacy even in a crowded room. Eleanor herself moves through these spaces with the confidence of someone who has navigated the highest circles of power since adolescence. Having inherited the vast duchy of Aquitaine at 15, married King Louis VII of France shortly after, accompanied the Second Crusade, secured an annulment on grounds of consanguinity, and then within weeks married Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become King Henry II of England, making her queen for a second time and giving her access to resources and influence that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. The rhythm of life in Eleanor's court follows a pattern established by custom and practical necessity. Mornings begin with attendance at Mass in the castle chapel, where the liturgy is sung by trained clergy and the noble household gathers in spaces designated by rank, the Queen and her closest companions near the altar, lesser members of the household farther back, and servants standing at the rear or outside in the courtyard if the chapel is too small to accommodate everyone. After Mass, the day opens into a series of meetings, audiences and administrative tasks, because a great household does not run itself. Stewards present accounts, disputes require adjudication, messengers arrive with news from distant estates or from the royal court, and decisions must be made about provisions, repairs, travel plans, and the 100 other details that keep a complex organization functioning. Eleanor, experienced in governance and possessed of her own lands and revenues independent of her husband's, exercises authority directly, issuing charters, appointing officials, and managing the extensive network of vassals, towns, and abbeys that owe allegiance to the Duchy of Aquitaine. The administrative work is dry but essential, conducted in chambers where clerks keep records in careful Latin script, where seals are applied to documents with warm wax, and where the mechanisms of feudal power operate through written agreements, oaths, and the slow accumulation of precedent and custom. Yet Eleanor's court is remembered not primarily for its administrative efficiency, but for its cultural brilliance, particularly its association with the troubadours, poet-musicians from the south of France who composed and performed songs in Occitan, the Languedoc, exploring themes of love, longing, service, and the delicate balance between desire and restraint that came to define courtly love. Imagine yourself in the evening, after the day's business has concluded, when the great hall is lit by candles and torches, their flames steady in the still air, and a troubadour steps forward with his vielle, a bowed string instrument whose sound is sweet and penetrating, tuning briefly before beginning a canso. A love song addressed to a lady of higher station, praising her beauty, lamenting her distance, and affirming the singer's willingness to endure suffering for the hope of her favor. The lyrics are sophisticated, employing metaphors drawn from feudal relationships, the lover as vassal, the lady as lord. And the melodies move with a modal quality that sounds both familiar and slightly strange to ears accustomed to later harmonic systems. Some troubadours are themselves nobles, men like Bertrand de Born or William IX, Eleanor's own grandfather, who was among the earliest known troubadours, while others are professional entertainers who travel from court to court, carrying news, gossip, and new compositions. Their presence welcomed because they bring variety and connection to a world where communication is slow and entertainment options limited. Courtly love, as articulated in these songs and in the romances that circulated in manuscript, operates under specific conventions. The beloved is typically married, unattainable, and idealized. The lover suffers nobly and patiently. Physical consummation is either deferred indefinitely or achieved only after elaborate trials. And the entire relationship is conducted with attention to secrecy, discretion, and the proper forms of address and behavior. Whether these literary conventions reflected actual practice or served as an aspirational fiction that allowed audiences to explore emotions and situations in a safe, controlled context remains a matter of scholarly debate. But the cultural impact was significant, shaping expectations about aristocratic behavior and providing a vocabulary for discussing relationships that moved beyond simple arrangements of property and alliance. Eleanor's own daughters and daughters-in-law participated in this culture, with Marie de Champagne, Eleanor's daughter by Louis VII, later commissioning Chrétien de Troyes to write romances that would become foundational texts of Arthurian literature, including Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, which explores the tension between chivalric honor and passionate love through the famous affair between Lancelot and Queen Guinevere. The connections between Eleanor's court, the troubadour tradition, and the flowering of vernacular romance in the late 12th century suggest a milieu where literary culture was taken seriously, where patronage supported artistic production, and where the values articulated in songs and stories were meant to shape the behavior of the nobility toward greater refinement and self-control. The material comforts of Eleanor's court contrast sharply with the hardships described in earlier segments. Where crusaders endured hunger and disease, the aristocratic household enjoys regular meals of considerable variety and abundance. Dinner, the main meal, is served around mid-morning or noon with courses brought from the kitchens in procession, roasted meats, game birds, fish on fast days, dishes flavored with expensive spices like pepper, ginger, and cinnamon imported from distant lands, potages thickened with almonds or breadcrumbs, and subtleties, elaborate confections shaped to resemble castles, animals, or heraldic devices. Wine flows from the Queen's own vineyards in Aquitaine, or is imported from regions known for quality, served in metal cups or fine glass vessels for the highest-ranking guests, diluted with water according to custom and individual preference, and accompanied by bread of varying fineness depending on one's status. The whitest, finest manchet for the high table, coarser muslin for lesser folk. The hall is warmed by large fireplaces, whose chimneys carry smoke up and out, a significant improvement over earlier arrangements where central hearths filled rooms with smoke that escaped through vents in the roof. Braziers provide additional heat in smaller chambers, and in winter, people wear layers of wool and fur, with the wealthiest displaying ermine, marten, and other luxury furs as lining and trim on cloaks and gowns. Eleanor herself would have dressed according to the highest standards of the age: fine linen undergarments, a long gown of silk or rich wool dyed in expensive colors like scarlet or deep blue, a surcoat or overgarment that might be fur-lined, sleeves that extend to cover the hands or trail fashionably long, and a circlet or crown to mark her royal status. Yet beneath the surface of courtly refinement runs a current of political tension, because Eleanor's relationship with Henry II deteriorated over the years, particularly after she supported a rebellion by her sons against their father in 1173-1174, an act that led to her imprisonment for 16 years, during which she was kept under guard in various English castles, her freedom restricted, and her participation in public life largely suspended. The political intrigues of the Angevin court were complex and often bitter. Henry's infidelities, particularly his long affair with Rosamund Clifford, were humiliating to Eleanor. The king's refusal to grant substantial independent power to his grown sons created resentment and frustrated ambition, and the vast territories controlled by the Angevin dynasty, stretching from Ireland to the Pyrenees, generated constant pressure from rivals, vassals, and the French crown. Imagine yourself as an observer in this world of competing loyalties, where a gathering in the Great Hall might include not only family members but also allies who could become enemies, vassals whose loyalty is contingent, foreign visitors assessing strengths and weaknesses, and servants who overhear conversations and carry information to interested parties. The business of court is conducted through conversation, through the strategic offering of gifts and favors, through marriages arranged to seal alliances, and through the careful management of reputation and appearances. Because in a society where power depends on personal relationships and the willingness of others to acknowledge one's authority, the performance of authority, through display, hospitality, justice, and cultural patronage, becomes as important as its legal or military foundations. The music continues into the evening, with performances by jongleurs and minstrels, in addition to the troubadours. Some reciting epic poems like the Chanson de Geste that celebrate Charlemagne and his paladins, others performing acrobatics, juggling, or comic routines that provide lighter entertainment after the more serious business of the day. The atmosphere is one of controlled festivity, where pleasure is pursued within the boundaries of decorum, where excesses are noted and judged, and where the ideal is to demonstrate both magnificence and restraint, both generosity and discernment. After Eleanor's release from imprisonment following Henry II's death in 1189, she re-emerged as a formidable political figure during the reigns of her sons Richard I and John, acting as regent, negotiating treaties, raising ransoms, and maintaining order in Aquitaine with the same skill she had displayed decades earlier. Her longevity, she lived into her 80s, dying in 1204, and her continued involvement in political affairs well into old age, testified to her resilience and intelligence, qualities that made her one of the most remarkable figures of the 12th century. The legacy of her court, particularly its association with courtly love and troubadour culture, influenced later medieval literature and shaped aristocratic ideals about the proper relationship between love, honor, and service, creating a cultural template that would be refined, challenged, and reimagined across subsequent centuries. The rhythm of her life, from duchess to queen to prisoner to dowager queen and elder stateswoman, traced an arc through some of the most significant events and transformations of the High Middle Ages, and the court she maintained in her years of freedom represented a space where power and culture reinforced each other, where governance and artistic patronage were understood as complementary rather than competing priorities. As evening deepens in that imagined hall, the candles burn lower, the music softens to a quieter register, and the assembled company begins to disperse towards sleeping chambers where straw mattresses are covered with linen sheets and wool blankets, where bed curtains can be drawn for privacy and warmth, and where the day's activities, administrative, social, political, cultural, give way to rest and the anticipation of tomorrow's similar but slightly different round of tasks and pleasures. The contrast between this world and the Crusaders' camp, between the luxury of Eleanor's court and the mystery of the Shroud, between the political calculations of kings and queens and the quiet endurance of those who marched in mail across foreign landscapes, illustrates the range of medieval experience, the distance between those who commanded and those who obeyed, between those who enjoyed tapestries and fine wines and those who counted themselves fortunate to have bread and clean water. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a long, narrow plot of dark earth, framed by low banks of woven reeds and the roots of slender willows. The lake is still. A pale band of light yawns open along the eastern horizon, picking out the lines of the gardens like threads. In the hush, you hear the faint, hollow beat of a wooden drum somewhere in the city's heart, and closer to you, the soft tapping of a pole against the side of a canoe. The air is cool, a little damp, and touched with the green scent of wet leaves and the faint sweetness of cut reeds. You step into the shallow canoe and feel its steadiness. Your hands know where to find the pole. The movement is unhurried. Plant, push, glide. The canoe slips between chinampas which are not truly floating but anchored. Rows of earth raised from the lakebed, edged with bundled reeds, and held by patient trees whose roots knit soil to water. Along the banks grows tulle and sedge, neat and purposeful. Beyond the gardens, in the distance, the temple pyramids are faint shapes, their edges softened by the mist. On the plot ahead, maize stands shoulder high, its leaves narrow and pleated. Between the rows, beans wind their way up the maize stalks, and low to the earth, squash spreads its broad, dappled leaves. The arrangement is thoughtful. One plant climbs, one supports, one shades the soil, and together they keep the ground moist and alive. This is the rhythm of their lives, cycle within cycle, a choreography of growth that repeats across the seasons. Before the day warms, you kneel and test the soil. It holds a cool firmness that tells you last night's watering was enough. Your hands know the weight of the mud, the texture of it, and what it promises. You begin with a small basket and a simple tool. Just a stick with a sharpened end, the kind of thing that is as old as farming itself. You loosen the earth around young plants, steady and careful. You are not hurrying. You are keeping pace with the day. Breakfast was simple and quiet. A steaming cup of atole, the maize drink that warms the body from the inside out, and a few tamales wrapped in leaves, mild and reassuring. The taste of ground maize lingers as you begin the long, familiar tasks. Weeding, checking the banks, dredging. The dredging is important. You guide the canoe along the canal margin and use a scoop to lift dark, rich mud from the bottom, heavy and soft, a kind of lake-borne compost that will feed the plants. You lift, let the water drain, and lay the thick, fertile mud along the bed's edge, smoothing it with the flat of your hand. It is a simple movement, and it is repeated many times until the bank is whole and solid again. Every few rows, you pause to check the willow poles that mark the corners of the chinampa. Their roots bite into the mud. You tighten a reed binding here, replace a worn section of wattle there. The gardens hold because people make them hold. In the distance, you hear the occasional call from another farmer, a greeting without urgency. Birds step along the shallows, herons careful as old men, coots muttering to themselves as if keeping a small ledger of the day's business. As the sun rises, the air grows warmer and you take off a layer, a woven mantle with a faint, clean smell of smoke from the hearth. The sweat you notice is light, more a film than a trickle. It is a sign that the day has begun in earnest. The city stirs. Sounds travel over water, someone sharpening a tool, someone laughing softly, and now and then the thin, bright note of a flute. The sense is steady, like a breath held and released without thought. Around midday, you pole to a shaded bank. You sit and unwrap a packet. Tortillas from this morning's griddle, and a small gourd bowl of beans and chile, thick and glossy. You eat slowly. The tortillas are warm from the sun and pliant. The beans mild with a hint of salt. The chile does not startle. It hums in the background and keeps you awake, but not tense. You drink water that tastes faintly of clay from the vessel that held it, clean and cool. After eating, you walk the rows again and check for pests. You find a few and flick them away with a thumb. You murmur a few words that name the field's protectors and the day's quiet hopes. These words are not for display. They belong to the work and the water and the slow patience of growing things. Then you return to the canoe and the pole's end taps the lake bottom, finding its depth by feel. In a place built on water, weather is both companion and concern. The gardens rest in a balance that is constantly kept and constantly at risk. You watch clouds gather at the rim of the basin, and you think of last season's rain, how quickly the lake can climb, how the canals swell, how the soil softens and shifts. Floods are not stories, they are events you can measure in lost plants and nights spent sleepless, checking banks by the light of small fires. There are signs you learn to read. The creak of the reeds when the wind changes direction, the way the water's surface puckers when the first drops arrive from the west, the low murmur from neighbors who have already moved their seedlings to higher ground, the memory of a year when the rains came and did not stop, and the chinampas lay under water for days, then weeks, and the harvest that followed was thin, and people exchanged little luxuries for staples in the market without complaint, because that is the bargain the city makes with the lake. When the season turns wet, you reinforce the banks. You drive new stakes and lace them with reeds. You pile dredged mud higher, shaping a slight crown so that water runs off rather than sits. You plant willows closer together, their roots braiding the edge to the earth. You do this knowing that sometimes the lake will simply insist. There is no drama in this knowledge. It is practical, and it keeps you attentive without making you anxious. You watch, you prepare, and you accept the facts as they arrive. On appointed days, the city's order extends its hand across the water. These are days of counting and carrying, of packages tied with fiber cords and careful records held in the minds of officials and the hands of trained keepers of knots and marks. Your household belongs to a neighborhood group, a community that shares duties and responsibilities. Together, you bring what is asked: a portion of maize, bundles of amaranth, gourds of dried chilies, woven mats that smell faintly of sun and rush, and on some cycles, something rarer and more exacting: small, oval cacao beans, each a tiny measure of value and promise. Cacao does not grow around your lake. It comes from warmer lands to the south, ferried in by long-distance traders who know the roads and the river mouths. Because it is rare here, each bean is counted carefully. You obtained them by exchanging your produce in the market at Tlatelolco, handing over baskets and receiving beans in return, listening to the soft clatter of them as they slid into a pouch. On tribute day, you sit at your mat in the evening and count again by lamplight. 100, 203. Your fingers know the smooth, dry skin of each bean, the slight give when pressed. You keep a few aside for offerings, a few for emergencies, and the rest you bind in little packets, tied with a strand of fiber so they cannot wander. In the morning, you bring your contributions to the collection place. The official, a calm man with an unreadable face, notes each household's delivery with a nod. He does not speak sharply. He does not need to. The system is old and well-worn, like a path that feet have made smooth. You hand over the packets and he tips them into a larger container with a soft rush of sound. The beans carry the scent of distant groves, a faint, clean bitterness that promises a luxury you taste only rarely, a drink saved for rites and high occasions. There is no resentment in the act. There is also no joy. It is a duty, a tequittal, a share of what the city requires to remain what it is. You go home lighter by a few baskets and a few beans, and you sleep without a heavy mind, knowing order has been kept. The city and the temple. Some days, your path takes you into the city's core. You pole along a wide canal where the water's surface reflects the edges of tall buildings and the sweeping lines of causeways. The markets hum, voices layered without sharpness, the pricing of gourds, the weighing of salt, the appraisal of feathers that glint like fragments of sunlight trapped in green. You move slowly, past stalls where pottery is stacked with satisfying neatness, past rows of woven cloth folded into squares that hold the faint scent of dye, and the river stones used to pound the fibers smooth. Above everything, the main temple rises with its twin sanctuaries. Today is a day of ceremony. You are not here for spectacle. You are here because the city is here, and its calendar arranges itself around days like this. The crowd's movement is measured. People speak in low tones, and the air holds the thick sweetness of copal resin, the smoke making thin blue banners that drift and fade. From where you stand, you can see the broad steps, their lines clean against the sky. At the top, priests move in garments that catch the light, white and red against the stone, feathered fringes that stir slightly in the breeze. The drums begin again, deeper now, accompanied by the breathy call of conch shells. The rhythm is not urgent, it is insistent, rhythmic, like a heartbeat amplified by distance. You know what such ceremonies can entail. You also know that the details are not for the faint or the restless mind. You keep your gaze steady and respectful. The sacrifice is spoken of in terms of balance, life offered so that the sun will continue its path, so that rain will remember to return, so that the maize will rise and tassel and fill the stores each year. The crowd watches, and for a brief time the city breathes in unison. You see figures led with solemnity, faces painted for the purpose, moving toward the place where duties are fulfilled. From far below, you cannot see much. You do not need to. You understand the cost and the intent. When the moment passes, the drums shift to a softer pattern. Attendants carry bodies away along the steps with a gravity that allows no confusion about what has happened and why. The air is heavy, but not frantic. A few people bow their heads, others stand quietly. You feel a steadying thought. You work so that others may work. They offer so that others may live. The city binds all of this together. It is not a comforting thought in the way of warm food or a soft blanket. It is another kind of comfort, the comfort of knowing where one stands in a world with rules and reasons. In the evening, back on the water, you think of the ceremonies without racing the mind. There is a fear that lives in most people's chests, a small, practical fear. Not of every day, not of the ordinary tasks, but of what can happen if fortune turns. A war that draws in the neighborhood, a debt that grows unwieldy, a misstep that leads to a household's unraveling. You have heard stories of men taken in battle, of captives set aside for offerings, of a person who agreed to play a god's role for the span of a year and then at the end fulfilled the role completely. Stories travel and settle. They do not always concern farmers like you, but they exist, and in the city's shared mind they are present. This fear does not rule your days. It is like a distant bell. You can hear it if you attend, but the sound is low. You live carefully, you keep your debts modest, you take part in the Calpulli's shared obligations so that others will stand beside you if need arises. You are kind to your neighbors and helpful to your kin because such bonds are a kind of anchor. You participate in rites that keep the world ordered as you understand it. The fear is not an enemy. It is a reminder to step softly and to align yourself with the rhythm that has carried your people through many seasons. As the year turns, the lake breathes deeper, the rains come. Some nights, wind moves over the water with a steady push that rattles the reed walls and plucks at the roof thatch. You rise in the night and check the banks with a torch. The flame is small and steady, cupped by the palm of your hand. You add a reed mat where water licks at the edge. You push the canoe's mooring farther up onto the bank. In the distance, another torch mirrors your movement. The two lights nod to one another gently in the wind, and then both are turned away, the hands that hold them already busy again. Floods can take much in a single day. A season's careful lines can blur underwater. Your response is not anger. It is a simple set of motions: secure, reinforce, salvage. You plant again where you can. You dry seeds near the hearth against the chance that more rain will come than the ground can hold. You check the willows and add supports. You keep faith with the work, because that is what the work requires. When the rains ease, the sun returns with a pale warmth that grows generous. The soil smells sweet again, and when you walk the narrow path between beds, your feet sink only a little. Tiny green points appear where you pressed seeds into the mud with your thumb. You do not rejoice loudly. You nod, and the breath you did not know you were holding is released. market days, and small luxuries. Every few days you go to Tlatelolco, the great market that hums like a hive. The space is organized, calm. Goods are arranged with care, rows of salt in small mounds, each identical to the next, baskets of chilies that glow like embers, piles of tomatoes bright as beads, dried fish that smell of river and sun, fresh herbs with a clean sharpness when crushed between finger and thumb. Prices are argued without heat, hands gesture, heads tilt. Agreements are made with a little nod and the passing of beans from one pouch to another. You might allow yourself a small luxury, a bit of chocolate drink, shared in a quiet corner on a festival day, thick and bitter and scented with vanilla, served in a painted cup you hold with both hands. Or perhaps a new obsidian blade for the household, its edge so fine you think more of caution than of cutting. You look at feathers, long green plumes like strands of soft rain, and though you do not buy them, you admire the way they catch the light, each barb a tiny ladder for brightness. Markets draw news as well as goods. You hear of caravans from the lowlands, of tribute arriving in orderly convoys, of distant towns and their good harvests or thin ones. Stories travel. Some are sharp and stick in the mind, a rumor of conflict, a complaint about officials whose measurements felt too strict. Others are gentle and pass like a breeze, a song someone composed for a child's naming, a joke about a canoe that swam like a fish and then chose to rest in the reeds for the day. You listen and let the sounds pass through you. The market's noise is not harsh. It is patterned, like rain on thatch. Evening, with lamps. As the day ends, you return along a channel where the surface is smooth and the light has gone the color of warm clay. Fires kindle along the banks. You can smell tortillas cooking on flat stones and a thin stew thickening in a pot that breathes slowly, releasing steam in small puffs. At your home, you wash your hands in cool water and feel the grit float away. You sit on a mat and eat without hurry. The stew tastes of maize and beans and a hint of herbs from the garden's edge. You drink water and then a last mouthful of atole for comfort. Before sleep, you step outside. The city is quiet in its own way. There are fewer voices, but still the distant tones of a drum, faint and uninsistent. The temple outlines are darker against the sky now. Between you and them are hundreds of small flames, each one a household settling to rest. The air has cooled, and the slight dampness on your skin has become a film of comfort rather than labor. You think of the fields, of the banks you reinforced, of the tribute you carried in beans that once hung on trees in a faraway humidity you have never felt. You think of the ceremony you witnessed, and the balance it promises. None of these thoughts moves quickly. They turn gently and then come to rest. You lie down on woven mats that smell faintly of river rushes and smoke, and you breathe in and you breathe out. Tonight the lake is calm. If the wind rises, you will hear it first in the reeds. If the rain comes, it will come softly, then more surely, as it always does. You trust that the willows will hold the edges, that the mud will feed the roots, that the seeds will find their path upward. The rhythm of their lives continues, as steady as the pull of your canoe's pole, as regular as the calendar's turn, as certain as the need to rise and work when the light returns. And as you drift towards sleep, the city holds you the way the water holds its gardens, supported, bordered, and steady. In the next part of our journey, we will move from these quiet rows into a life lived at the center of ceremony and power, where decisions were as heavy as stone and as fragile as breath. For now, let the last sounds of evening fade and rest. We leave the Chinampas now, moving along wider canals toward the center of the city, where the stones are more carefully fitted and the walls rise higher. The rhythm of their lives continues, but the scale changes. Imagine yourself among the crowds that gather when the emperor passes, not close enough to speak, but near enough to watch the procession's slow formality, the careful placement of each footstep, the way attendants sweep the ground before him and collect the earth his feet have touched. You would not look directly at his face. You would lower your gaze and feel the weight of presence without needing to see it fully. This is where we meet Moctezuma II, whose name meant "he who frowns like a lord." He inherited an empire in 1502, at a moment when the world seemed ordered and predictable, when tribute flowed steadily from the edges toward the center, when the calendar's rituals unfolded with the precision of well-rehearsed ceremony. He was not the first Moctezuma, nor the last of the great Tlatoc, the speakers, the rulers who sat at the intersection of human and divine authority. But his story is the one that carries the greatest weight of irony and loss, the one where confidence met confusion, and an entire world folded inward like a closing flower. Let us trace his path with patience, beginning with the early years when his authority felt as solid as the temple stones. Moctezuma was not born to idle comfort. Before he ruled, he served. The path to leadership among the Mexica required demonstration, military skill, ritual knowledge, administrative capability, and the capacity to hold stillness in the presence of sacred things. As a young man, he distinguished himself in campaigns to the south and east, capturing warriors destined for the sacrificial stone, earning the feathered insignia that marked courage and success. His movements were measured, his speech careful. Those who remembered him from those years spoke of his reserve, his attention to protocol, his reluctance to speak before he had considered all angles of a question. When he ascended to the throne, he enacted reforms that tightened the empire's ceremonial life. He restricted access to the palace, requiring that even high nobles observe elaborate codes of dress and deportment in his presence. Commoners could no longer serve in certain positions close to the ruler. Purity of lineage became a concern, a way of drawing sharper lines between the divine office and the ordinary world. Some whispered that he was too rigid, too concerned with distance and formality. Others saw strength in clarity, in knowing where one stood and what was expected. The empire he governed stretched from the hot coastal plains to the cold pine forests of the mountains, from the lands of the Huastecs in the north to the territories bordering Maya country in the south. It was not a unified state in the way you might imagine. It was a network of obligations and tributes, of cities that sent their goods and acknowledged Tenochtitlan's preeminence, but retained their own rulers and languages and gods. The glue was practical. Better to send tribute than to face armies, better to align with the powerful than to stand alone. And so jade arrived from Veracruz, cacao from the lowlands, feathers from tropical forests, gold dust from mountain streams, and cotton from warm valleys. The flow was constant, mapped in the minds of officials and recorded in painted books where glyphs and numbers told the story of what was owed and when. Moctezuma's days unfolded in layers of ritual. He rose early, bathed in water, scented with herbs, dressed in garments that no commoner could touch without consequence. He consulted with his council, men whose advice was given quietly and weighed carefully. He heard reports from tribute collectors, from military captains, from priests who read the calendar and the sky for signs of favor or warning. He presided over ceremonies where his presence sanctified the act, where his voice, rarely raised, always controlled, confirmed the world's order. In the evenings, he dined alone, or nearly so, attended but not accompanied, his food arriving on painted platters and tasted first by others, a caution that spoke to the loneliness of absolute authority. The empire seemed stable. Harvests were reliable enough. The subject cities grumbled but complied. Tenochtitlan grew, its population swelling past 200,000, its markets drawing traders from distant regions, its temples rising higher as each ruler sought to inscribe his name in stone and ceremony. The rhythm of their lives at this level was not about planting and dredging. It was about coordination on a scale that required hundreds of functionaries. about messages carried by runners along stone roads, about tribute tallies checked and rechecked, about the slow accumulation of power expressed in architecture and featherwork, and the movement of armies. Around 1510, or perhaps a little later, things began to appear that did not fit the established pattern. There are accounts, recorded later by those who survived, of omens that unsettled the city. A temple caught fire without cause, burning with an intensity that resisted all attempts to douse it. A comet was seen, leaving a pale trail across the night sky, its appearance discussed in low voices by priests and diviners. The lake rose suddenly one night, flooding streets without warning, as if the water itself had chosen to remind the city of its presence. A bird was brought to Moctezuma, a strange crane with a mirror on its head, and when he looked into the mirror, he saw distant figures, armed, moving, unlike any he knew. These stories carry the weight of hindsight. We cannot know if they were real or invented later to explain what felt inexplicable. What matters is that they became part of the story, woven into the narrative of an empire that began to sense something beyond its borders, something that did not announce itself in the usual ways. Then came the reports, more concrete and more troubling. Strangers had been seen on the coast, men with pale faces and thick beards, wearing metal that gleamed like silver, riding creatures that seemed half deer, half something else entirely. They traveled in large wooden structures that floated on the sea, their sails catching the wind like wings. They carried sticks that made noise like thunder and could kill at a distance. The first encounter had been in 1517, a brief, violent skirmish on the Yucatan coast. The second came the following year. By 1519, the reports were more detailed and more persistent. Moctezuma sent emissaries to the coast, men trained in observation and diplomacy. They carried gifts, feathered cloaks, gold jewelry, finely woven cloth. They also carried questions. Who were these strangers? What did they want? Were they, as some whispered, the returning god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, whose legends spoke of a departure to the east and a promise to return? The idea was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it fit within known stories, terrifying because gods do not negotiate, and their purposes are not always merciful. The emissaries returned with troubling news. The strangers were interested in gold. They asked questions about the empire's wealth, its cities, its ruler. They were not hostile exactly, but they were insistent, and they did not seem impressed by the gifts they received. They wanted more, and they wanted to move inland. Their leader, a man named Hernan Cortés, sent messages that were polite but firm. He spoke of a great king across the sea, of a god who had sent him, of a desire to meet Moctezuma face to face. Throughout 1519, Cortés and his small band, perhaps 400 Spanish soldiers, plus a growing number of indigenous allies from cities that resented Tenochtitlan's dominance, moved slowly toward the Valley of Mexico. Moctezuma's response was cautious, layered, and ultimately indecisive. He sent more emissaries with more gifts, hoping perhaps to satisfy the strangers' curiosity and turn them back. He sent magicians, hoping to use supernatural means to halt their progress. He consulted priests and diviners, seeking clarity from the calendar and the gods. He debated with his council, some urging confrontation, others urging patience. The gifts did not deter Cortés. The magicians, if they were sent, had no effect. The omens offered no clear guidance, or at least none that led to decisive action. And so the strangers kept coming, climbing from the hot coast into the temperate highlands, passing through cities that opened their gates, some out of fear, some out of hope that these newcomers might tip the balance against Tenochtitlan. Imagine the conversations in the palace, held in rooms lit by torches, the air thick with copal smoke. Moctezuma sits on a low seat, his face composed, his hands resting lightly on his knees. Around him, advisors speak in turn. One argues for ambush, catch the strangers on the road, in a narrow pass, where numbers and knowledge of terrain would favor the Mexica. Another counsels caution. These strangers have thunder weapons, and they move with confidence that suggests powerful magic or powerful backing. A third suggests negotiation, testing their intentions before committing to open conflict. Moctezuma listens, his expression unreadable, and when he speaks, his words are measured. He will wait, he will observe, he will not act hastily. This was not cowardice. It was the caution of a man trained to think in terms of ritual propriety and cosmic balance, a man for whom uncertainty about the stranger's nature, human, divine, something between, made decisive violence feel like a dangerous gamble. He was emperor of 15 million people, but he was also a man operating within a framework of beliefs that did not include a category for these bearded, metal-clad intruders. In November 1519, Cortés and his forces reached Tenochtitlan. They crossed the southern causeway, walking above the lake on a road wide enough for 8 horses to pass abreast. The city spread before them, white buildings, rising pyramids, canals filled with canoes, the great market at Tlatelolco humming like a distant hive. The Spanish soldier Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who walked that causeway and later wrote of it, said they wondered if they were dreaming, if what they saw could be real. Moctezuma came to meet them, carried on a litter surrounded by nobles who swept the ground before him. When he descended, Cortés approached. The two men faced each other, separated by language, by culture, by assumptions so different that the ground between them was less a space than a chasm. Gifts were exchanged, courtesies were observed. Moctezuma, through interpreters, welcomed the strangers to his city. Cortés, also through interpreters, thanked him and spoke of his distant king. Neither man could fully understand the other's world. The Spanish were given quarters in one of the palaces near the main plaza. It was a generous space, comfortable, provisioned with food and attendance. But Cortés was uneasy. He was vastly outnumbered, surrounded by a population that could, if it chose, simply overwhelm him. Within days he made a move that was audacious to the point of madness. He took Moctezuma hostage. The circumstances are debated. The sources, written later and colored by the agendas of their authors, do not entirely agree, but the outline is clear enough. Cortés, claiming that an attack on his men elsewhere required justice, insisted that Moctezuma come to the Spanish quarters, ostensibly to discuss matters, in truth, to remain there under guard. Moctezuma, perhaps bewildered, perhaps calculating that compliance would buy time and avoid immediate bloodshed, agreed. He moved into the Spanish quarters and remained there, a prisoner in his own city. For months he conducted the business of empire from that confined space, receiving officials, issuing orders, maintaining the appearance of authority. The Spanish treated him with formal respect. He was housed well, fed well, attended by his own servants, but he was not free. Guards stood at every door. When he wished to leave, it was only with Spanish escort. The emperor of an empire had become, in effect, a hostage. How did this happen? How did a man who commanded armies, who could order the construction of temples and the execution of captives, find himself confined by a few hundred foreign soldiers? The answers are complex and painful. Moctezuma operated within a cultural logic where direct confrontation with potential divine figures felt dangerous, where preserving cosmic order sometimes meant enduring personal humiliation, where the appearance of calm control mattered more than immediate action. He may have hoped that compliance would reveal the strangers' true intentions, that they would take what they wanted and leave, that the situation could be managed without plunging the city into chaos. He may have believed that his own captivity was a temporary inconvenience, a price paid to protect the larger structure. His nobles were not all so patient. Some urged rebellion, some gathered forces in secret. The tension in the city grew like a low hum, felt but not yet fully articulated. The Spanish sensed it. They tightened their control. They demanded gold, and Moctezuma ordered the royal treasuries opened. objects of breathtaking beauty, gold worked into the shapes of animals and gods, jade carvings that captured light, feathered mosaics that took months to assemble, were brought forth and in many cases melted down by the Spanish, reduced to crude ingots that could be divided and shipped. In spring 1520, Cortés had to leave the city briefly to deal with a rival Spanish force that had arrived on the coast. He left a subordinate, Pedro de Alvarado, in command. During a religious festival, with the city's attention focused on ceremony, Alvarado's men launched an attack on the gathered nobles, killing hundreds in the temple courtyard. The reasons remain unclear, whether Alvarado feared an uprising, whether he acted out of greed or paranoia or simple cruelty. The result was unambiguous. The city erupted. When Cortés returned, Tenochtitlan was in open revolt. The causeways were cut. The Spanish were besieged in their quarters, surrounded by tens of thousands of angry warriors and citizens who threw stones and shot arrows and demanded blood. Moctezuma, at Cortés's urging, appeared on the roof of the palace to calm his people, to ask them to stop the fighting. It was a plea, and it was also a humiliation. The crowd did not listen. They shouted. Some threw stones. One struck Moctezuma. He was pulled back inside, wounded. Within days, he was dead. The Spanish sources claim he died from the stone's blow, from the betrayal of his own people. The indigenous sources suggest he was killed by the Spanish, strangled or stabbed when he was no longer useful. We do not know with certainty. Both versions carry the weight of tragedy. Either way, the emperor who had ruled 15 million died in captivity, his authority dissolved, his city consumed by violence he could not control. The Spanish fought their way out of Tenochtitlan in a chaotic night battle, losing perhaps half their number and most of their stolen gold in the lake. Cortés wept, it is said, beneath a cypress tree, mourning his losses. But he did not give up. He retreated, regrouped, and returned the following year with more men, more indigenous allies, and a brutal, methodical siege that would grind the city down over months. The story of Moctezuma is often told as one of weakness or indecision, but that misses the deeper currents. It is a story of two worlds that could not quite see each other clearly, that interpreted each other's actions through incompatible frameworks. Cortés saw an empire ripe for conquest, a population that could be divided and exploited, a ruler who hesitated and could therefore be taken. Moctezuma saw strangers whose nature was uncertain, whose presence might be part of a cosmic pattern, whose motives did not fit the usual categories of diplomacy or war. The miscommunications were many and profound. When the Spanish asked for gold, they meant wealth, portable and convertible. When the Mexica gave gold, they meant art, sacred objects charged with meaning, gifts that established relationships. When Cortés spoke of his king and his god, the interpreters struggled to find equivalents in Nahuatl, and what emerged was a muddle of divine kingship and foreign deities that left both sides talking past each other. When Moctezuma was polite and accommodating, Cortés saw submission. When Cortés was aggressive and demanding, Moctezuma saw a test or a challenge that might be managed through patience and ritual correctness. The empire's fall was not the result of a single failure. It was the result of a vast structure built on tribute and intimidation, meeting a small, ruthless force backed by European diseases, metal weapons, and a willingness to ally with discontented subjects. It was the result of a leader trained for one kind of world, trying to navigate another. It was the result of timing, chance, and the grinding reality that sometimes understanding comes too late. When Moctezuma died, the city mourned and did not mourn. His successor, Cuitlahuac, led the resistance that drove the Spanish out temporarily, but he died within months, claimed by smallpox, the invisible companion of conquest. The next ruler, Cuauhtémoc, was young and fierce, and he held the city as long as he could, but the siege was merciless. Food ran out. Water became scarce. Disease spread. The Spanish and their allies tightened the noose, fighting block by block, canal by canal. In August 1521, the city fell. Cuauhtémoc was captured. The empire was over. The causeway where Moctezuma had greeted Cortés with ceremony became a road where survivors walked in silence, carrying what little they had left. The great market at Tlatelolco grew quiet. The temples were pulled down, their stones repurposed for churches. The painted books were burned. The language persisted, but the world that language described was fractured. Moctezuma's story reminds us that leaders are not always architects of their own fates. He inherited an empire, tried to protect it through caution and ritual, and watched it dissolve despite, perhaps because of, his efforts. His failure was human, not monstrous. He was trapped between worlds, speaking a language no one fully understood, carrying a weight that no ceremony could lift. As the night deepens and you feel your breathing slow, think of him not as a villain or a fool, but as a man standing in a doorway, watching something he could not name approach along a stone road, hoping that patience and propriety would be enough. Learning too late that sometimes the world simply changes, and no amount of careful speech or ritual purity can hold it still. We move now from the throne rooms and causeways into quieter spaces. Museum halls with their controlled light, archives where scholars debate in hushed voices, and the dim workshops where stone is shaped with infinite patience. The empire fell, but objects remained. Some were carried away as trophies, some were buried and forgotten, some were treasured, hidden, or remade, and some, it seems, arrived in the world much later, carrying stories that fit too neatly, that answer questions we want answered rather than questions we should ask. Among the most enigmatic of these objects are the crystal skulls. You may have seen images of them. Translucent quartz carved into the shape of a human skull, smooth and detailed, catching light in ways that seem almost alive. They have been called Aztec, called ancient, called sacred. They have been displayed in museums and featured in documentaries. They have inspired theories about lost technologies, supernatural powers, and hidden knowledge. And yet, when we look closely, when we examine them with the tools of science and the patience of scholarship, the story becomes less certain, more tangled, and ultimately more interesting than any simple legend. Let us walk through this mystery with care, without rushing to conclusions, attending to what we know and what we do not, and why the difference matters. Imagine yourself standing before one of these skulls in a museum case. The room is cool and quiet. The lighting is arranged to minimize glare, to let the stone speak on its own terms. The skull before you is roughly life-sized, carved from a single piece of clear quartz. Light moves through it, refracting, creating small rainbows where angles meet. The surface is smooth, polished to a finish that feels almost liquid. The eye sockets are hollow, dark, and when you move your head slightly, the shadows within shift. The skull is anatomically detailed, though not perfectly so. The teeth are suggested rather than fully separated. The nasal cavity is present. The cheekbones curve in a way that suggests a human face, though simplified, abstracted. There are no tool marks visible to the naked eye, no sign of the grinding and shaping that would typically accompany stone carving. It sits on its base, the bottom slightly flattened, as if it were meant to rest upright, to be looked at, perhaps to look back. Other skulls exist in various collections. Some are smaller, carved from different types of quartz, smoky, cloudy, or rose-tinted. Some are more crudely made, with visible tool marks and less refined detail. Some are exquisitely detailed, with removable jaw pieces, intricate undercuts, and a level of polish that rivals fine optics. Each has its own story of provenance, its own chain of ownership, and its own set of claims about age and origin. The most famous is perhaps the Mitchell Hedges skull, named after a British adventurer who claimed his daughter discovered it in the ruins of a Maya city in Belize in the 1920s. It is beautifully made, perfectly symmetrical, and so transparent that when light passes through it, the stone seems to glow from within. The story of its discovery has the feel of adventure fiction. A young woman reaching into a collapsed altar, pulling forth a crystal head, presenting it to her astonished father. It is a story that invites wonder, but stories and evidence do not always agree. When we speak of pre-Columbian artifacts, we mean objects made before 1492, before European contact reshaped the Americas. We mean objects that belong to the worlds of the Olmec, the Maya, the Aztec, the Zapotec, cultures that worked stone with mastery and patience, that understood jade and obsidian and basalt, that created art from materials the earth provided. To call a crystal skull pre-Columbian is to claim it belongs to that tradition, that it was shaped by those hands and those tools, that it carries knowledge from that time. The test of such claims is not belief or desire, it is evidence. And for the crystal skulls, the evidence has been accumulating quietly and carefully for decades. In the 1990s and early 2000s, several major museums subjected their crystal skulls to detailed scientific analysis. Researchers at the British Museum, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris used electron microscopy, a technique that allows examination at a scale invisible to the unaided eye. They looked at the surface of the skulls, searching for the marks left by the tools that shaped them. What they found was consistent and troubling for those who believed in the skull's ancient origin. The surfaces bore the traces of rotary tools, specifically jewelers' wheels that spin at high speeds, the kind of equipment that became common in Europe in the 19th century. Pre-Columbian lapidaries worked differently. They used abrasive sands, drills weighted with stone, and slow, patient grinding that left characteristic marks, parallel scratches, irregular facets, a texture that speaks of hand pressure and time. The crystal skulls showed none of this. Instead, they showed the smooth, regular arcs of mechanized polishing, the kind achieved with modern equipment and modern compounds. Radiocarbon dating, which works well for organic materials, cannot date stone. But other methods exist. Researchers examined the skulls for signs of weathering, for accumulation of surface deposits, for the microscopic changes that occur when an object has been buried for centuries. They found surfaces too clean, too perfect, lacking the subtle degradation that time imposes. They traced provenance, following ownership back through auction records, letters and receipts, and found that most skulls appeared in the market in the late 19th or early 20th centuries, offered by dealers who specialized in curiosities and whose other claims often proved dubious. None of this proves with absolute certainty that no crystal skull could be ancient. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, but it shifts the weight of likelihood. The simplest explanation, the one that requires no special pleading, no invisible gaps in the record, no technologies for which we have no other evidence, is that the crystal skulls are products of the 19th and early 20th centuries, carved by skilled artisans in Europe or possibly Mexico, using modern tools, and sold into a market hungry for exotic artifacts and romantic stories. Even if the skulls are not ancient, their making required skill. Quartz is hard, 7 on the Mohs scale, harder than steel. It fractures unpredictably. It does not yield easily to pressure. To carve a skull from a single block of clear quartz, even with modern rotary tools, is a feat of patience and expertise. Imagine the craftsman in his workshop, perhaps in the Ida Oberstein region of Germany, long famous for gem cutting, or in Mexico City, where lapidaries continued working in traditional and modern styles. He begins with a rough block of quartz, perhaps weighing several kilograms, cold and heavy in the hands. He examines it for flaws, internal fractures, inclusions, planes of weakness. He plans his cuts to avoid these, to work with the stone structure rather than against it. He mounts the block on a lathe or a fixed base. He selects his tools, diamond-tipped wheels for rough shaping, finer wheels for detail, polishing compounds mixed with water or oil. The wheel spins, a steady hum, and he brings the stone to it, carefully, feeling for the bite, adjusting pressure and angle. The work is slow, too much force, and the stone shatters, too little and nothing happens. He works in stages, rough form first, then refinement, then detail. The eye sockets must be hollowed without piercing through. The teeth must be suggested. The curve of the cranium must be smooth and true. Hours pass into days, days into weeks. The stone is heavy, and the wheel's vibration travels up through the hands. Quartz dust, fine as flour, floats in the air, and the craftsman breathes through a cloth, pauses to drink water, wipes his brow. The workshop smells of grinding stone, of oil, of the faint metallic tang of the tools. Light catches in the emerging form, and he sees where more work is needed, where a surface is still rough, where an angle is not quite right. Finally, the polishing. This is the longest stage. He switches to felt wheels, charged with finer and finer abrasives, cerium oxide, aluminum oxide, compounds that transform the dull, scratched surface into something that holds light and lets it pass. He works each surface in turn, methodically, until the skull is smooth and clear, until you can look through it and see the world beyond, refracted and softened by the stone. This is no simple task. It requires knowledge, equipment, and time, but it does not require supernatural powers. It does not require lost civilizations with technologies we cannot imagine. It requires a skilled human being, patient tools, and the same steady determination that has driven craftwork in every era. Part of the crystal skull's appeal lies not just in their beauty or supposed antiquity, but in the powers attributed to them. You will find, if you search, claims that the skulls emit energy, that they can heal, that they contain encoded information from ancient or extraterrestrial sources, that they were used for communication or prophecy. Some believers speak of 13 skulls that, when gathered together, will unlock great wisdom or prevent catastrophe. These stories are appealing. They offer mystery, significance, and the sense that hidden knowledge waits to be discovered. But let us examine such claims with the same calm attention we have given to the physical objects. Quartz is piezoelectric. It generates a small electrical charge when compressed, which is why it is used in watches and electronics. But this property is well understood, measurable, and does not extend to spontaneous energy emission or information storage in the way mystical claims suggest. Crystals have been valued in many cultures for their beauty and rarity, and symbolic meanings have been attached to them, but this does not confer supernatural function. The idea that the skulls contain information is harder to test directly because it is not specified what kind of information or how it could be accessed. If the claim is metaphorical, that contemplating a beautiful object can inspire thought or calm the mind, then it is true in the way that any art can be true. If the claim is literal, that data is somehow encoded in the crystal structure, then we would need a mechanism, and no such mechanism has been demonstrated. Quartz's atomic structure is regular and predictable. There is no evidence of patterns within the skulls that could serve as data storage in any meaningful sense. The healing claims fall into a similar category. Many people report feeling calm or centered in the presence of crystals, and this is a real experience, but it is more simply explained by the human capacity for focus and the aesthetic pleasure of beautiful objects. The placebo effect is powerful and not to be dismissed. Belief can influence well-being. But this is a property of the mind, not the stone. As for the legend of 13 skulls, this appears to be a modern invention, popularized in the late 20th century, with no clear basis in Aztec or Maya tradition. Pre-Columbian cultures did use skull imagery extensively in carvings, in murals, in the Tzompantli racks that held the skulls of sacrificial victims. The skull was a symbol of death, transformation, and the cycle of life. But there is no documentary evidence of crystal skulls in inventories, in chronicles, in the detailed tribute lists, or in the painted books that survived. To understand what pre-Columbian lapidaries could and did achieve, we can look at objects whose provenance is secure. The Aztecs and their neighbors worked obsidian, a volcanic glass sharper than any metal blade, into knives, mirrors, and ornaments. They carved jade, harder than quartz, into masks, pendants, and figurines of breathtaking detail. They shaped basalt and greenstone into massive sculptures that still stand in museums. Their surfaces worked with stone tools and abrasive sands, their forms both monumental and delicate. These objects show tool marks consistent with pre-Columbian techniques. They show weathering, burial patterns, and contexts that tie them to specific sites and periods. They appear in Spanish accounts from the conquest era, described with wonder and catalogued as tribute or loot. They exist within a web of evidence that supports their age and origin. Crystal was used, but rarely and in smaller objects. A few examples exist: small beads, simple pendants, a tiny carved figurine or two. The material was valued, but it was difficult to work and prone to fracture. The fact that large, elaborate crystal carvings are absent from the archaeological record, and that they appear suddenly in the 19th century curio market, suggests strongly that they were not part of the pre-Columbian tradition. Why then do the crystal skulls persist in popular imagination? Why do people want to believe in their ancient origin and mystical power? Partly it is the allure of the lost and the hidden. We are drawn to the idea that the past holds secrets we have not yet uncovered, that ancient peoples knew things we have forgotten, that beneath the surface of the ordinary lies something extraordinary. This impulse is not foolish. It drives exploration, scholarship, and the kind of curiosity that leads to genuine discovery. But it can also lead us astray, causing us to accept stories that feel satisfying without demanding the evidence that would make them true. Partly, it is the beauty of the objects themselves. The skulls are striking. They catch light, they hold the gaze, they invite contemplation. In a world that often feels too fast, too crowded, too lacking in mystery, an object that seems to bridge the mundane and the magical offers comfort and wonder. And partly it is the structure of belief. Once a story takes root, it becomes hard to dislodge. Evidence against it can be reframed as conspiracy, as closed-mindedness, as the establishment refusing to see. True believers point to gaps in our knowledge, and there are always gaps, and fill them with the narrative they prefer. This is a human tendency, not limited to crystal skulls. We do it with history, with science, with politics. We shape the world to fit the stories we tell ourselves. But there is a different kind of wonder available, one that does not require us to ignore evidence or invent mysteries where none exist. The real history of the Aztecs, the Chinampas, built reed by reed, the empire managed through tribute and record-keeping, the fall of Tenochtitlan, and the survival of its people, is more complex, more human, and ultimately more moving than any story of magical skulls. The real skill of lapidaries, whether ancient or modern, working stone with patience and knowledge, is worthy of respect without embellishment. As the night deepens and the distant sounds of the city fade to a low murmur, let yourself rest in the space between knowing and not knowing. The crystal skulls are beautiful objects, carved by skilled hands, probably in the 19th or early 20th century, and sold into a world that wanted to believe in ancient wonders. They are not evil or worthless, they are simply not what they were claimed to be. The Aztecs left us much, their language still spoken by over 1 million people, their agricultural techniques still visible in chinampas that produce food today, their art preserved in museums and private collections, their stories recorded in documents and oral traditions. They do not need crystal skulls to be remarkable. Their actual achievements, building a city on a lake, managing an empire without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, creating art and architecture that still moves us, are wonder enough. If you seek mystery, look to the questions that remain genuinely open: how the Aztecs achieved the precision of their stone masonry without metal tools, how they organized labor on such a scale, how their astronomical knowledge, encoded in calendars of intricate beauty, allowed them to track celestial events with remarkable accuracy. These mysteries have answers, but the answers require study, patience, and a willingness to engage with complexity. If you seek wonder, look to the night sky. They observed the same stars we see, moving through the same patterns. Look to the fields they planted, the same earth we plant. Look to the hands that shaped stone, not with machines but with other stones, with sand and water and time. The wonder is not in the supernatural, it is in the human. The crystal skulls, for all their shine and their stories, teach us something valuable. That we must hold beauty and truth separately, that we must ask hard questions even of things we want to believe, and that the past does not need our inventions to be worth our attention. We leave the questions of crystal and authenticity behind now, and return to what we know with greater certainty: the palace itself. The spaces where power was performed and life was lived according to rules so intricate they formed a kind of dance. Imagine yourself not as a resident, for that would require birth into a noble lineage, but as an observer permitted to stand quietly in a corner, to watch without speaking, to witness the rhythm of their lives as it unfolded within walls of stone and courtyards open to the sky. The palace of Tenochtitlan was not a single building, but a complex, a city within the city. It sprawled across several acres near the main temple precinct, its rooms and halls and gardens connected by corridors and courtyards, by passageways that shifted from sun to shadow and back again. Some rooms were vast, built to hold councils and ceremonies, their ceilings high and their walls bare, except for painted murals that told stories of conquest and divine favor. Other rooms were small and intimate, chambers where a few people might gather to speak in low voices, where the smell of copal incense mixed with the faint scent of flowers brought in fresh each morning. The palace housed not just the ruler but his extensive household: wives and concubines, children and their attendants, advisors and scribes, stewards who managed the flow of tribute, guards who stood at doorways with obsidian-tipped spears, servants who carried water and swept floors and tended the lamps that burned through the night. It was a world of hierarchy made visible, where every person's position was marked by what they wore, where they stood, and how they moved through space. Let us walk these halls slowly, attending to details, to the small gestures and the large structures that together formed the life of privilege and burden at the empire's heart. Of all the treasures that filled the palace storerooms, few were as valued as featherwork. These were not simple decorations, they were expressions of wealth, status, and the empire's reach, created with a skill that transformed something light and fragile into art that would outlast stone. The feathers arrived as tribute from the tropical lowlands, quetzal plumes from the cloud forests, their green so deep it held blue and gold within it, each tail feather as long as a man's arm and curved like a prayer. Scarlet macaw feathers that caught light like small fires, blue cotinga feathers with a sheen like polished metal, yellow parrot feathers, white egret plumes, tiny hummingbird skins with their iridescent throats intact. These were not ordinary goods. A single quetzal tail feather could be worth more than a commoner earned in a season. A large feathered headdress could be worth more than a house. The feather workers, the amanteca, worked in dedicated quarters of the city, in rooms where light entered softly and tools were kept with reverence. Imagine one such workshop, Quiet, clean, the air still. The craftsman sits on a low stool, a woven mat before him. He has spent the morning sorting feathers by size and color, arranging them in shallow baskets, touching each one with care, because damage means loss, and loss means shame. Now he begins the work of assembly. The base is maguey fiber or cotton cloth, sized and stiffened. He has already drawn the design in charcoal, checked the proportions, consulted the patron's wishes. Today, he works on a cloak panel that will hang from a nobleman's shoulders during ceremonies. The design shows a jaguar in profile, its spots rendered in careful arrangement, its eye a single bead of obsidian that will be set last. He selects a feather, trims it with a small obsidian blade, and applies adhesive, a paste made from orchid bulbs, sticky and slow drying. He places the feather precisely, presses it gently, holds it for a moment, then releases. He selects the next feather, overlapping slightly, matching the angle so that light will flow across the surface without breaks. His hands move steadily. There is no hurry. The work may take weeks. When complete, the cloak will shimmer as its wearer moves, the jaguar seeming to breathe, its form emerging and receding with each step. In the palace, such garments filled entire rooms. They were stored carefully, wrapped in clean cloth, inspected regularly for damage from insects or humidity. When a noble dressed for ceremony, attendants would bring forth the appropriate regalia. A cloak depicting the sun, its rays in yellow and red. A headdress towering above the head, quetzal plumes cascading down the back like a waterfall of green light. Armbands and anklets worked with smaller feathers in geometric patterns. A shield faced with featherwork, showing the warrior's patron deity or lineage sign. To wear such things was to carry wealth on one's body, to announce rank without speaking, to move through space as a statement of power and beauty combined. But it was also to bear a kind of fragility. The feathers could not be crushed or wet. The wearer had to move with consciousness, with the knowledge that what adorned them was both priceless and perishable. The palace kitchens worked from dawn past nightfall, a steady production of meals that fed hundreds. But the emperor's own table was a different matter, a display of the empire's extent rendered edible. Each morning, hunters from the royal preserves brought in game, quail and duck from the lake marshes, deer from the mountain forests, wild turkey plump and recently taken. Fishermen arrived with fresh catch still moving in woven baskets. Whitefish from the clear waters of Lake Chalco, small silverfish called amilotl, frogs from the shallow reeds, and on special occasions axolotl, those strange salamanders with their feathery gills and their mild, delicate flesh. From the tribute system came specialties that marked the empire's diversity. Cacao arrived from the hot coastal valleys, each bean carefully counted and stored. Vanilla came in long pods that smelled of warmth and sweetness. Chilies arrived in varieties, the mild, almost sweet chilhuacal, the smoky chipotle, the fierce, tiny chile piquin that could make eyes water with a single seed. Tomatoes came in many colors, red, yellow, green, purple. Avocados arrived wrapped in leaves, sapote fruits with their orange flesh. Pineapples from the south, their skins still rough, their scent announcing tropical distances. Salt was brought from coastal evaporation ponds, some white and fine, some dark and mineral-rich. Honey came in sealed gourds, the work of stingless bees. Herbs arrived fresh, epazote with its sharp medicinal scent, hoja santa with its broad leaves and anise fragrance, cilantro and papalo, and a dozen others whose names have been half forgotten, but whose flavors were essential. The preparation was elaborate. Imagine the head cook consulting with stewards about the day's menu, considering what was fresh, what was seasonal, what was appropriate for the occasion. He assigns tasks to his assistants, some to grind maize on metates, the rhythmic scraping a constant background sound, some to tend the fires, adjusting heat by adding or removing coals, some to prepare sauces, molds that require 30 ingredients, each toasted and ground and combined in precise order. The result, a dark, complex liquid that tastes of earth and sun and patient transformation. The emperor's meal was served with ceremony. Dishes arrived on painted pottery, each one chosen to complement the food. Tortillas were kept warm under cloths, their surfaces still slightly puffed from the commel's heat. Tamales were unwrapped from their corn husk packages, steaming, filled with turkey and mole, or beans with herbs, or nothing but maize and salt. Stews were presented in bowls, painted with water symbols and fish. Chocolate was prepared in tall vessels, poured from a height to create foam, the sound a soft rushing that promised richness. The emperor ate in semi-privacy, attended but not watched directly. Servants brought dishes in succession, offering quietly, retreating when the selection was made. He might taste 10 dishes, 20, taking small portions, eating slowly. This was not gluttony but display, proof that the empire could provide, that distance was no barrier, that the center could command the edges and make them yield their specialties. The leftovers were distributed according to rank. What the emperor did not finish went to high nobles. What they did not finish went to lesser officials. What remained was shared among servants. Nothing was wasted. Even bones were collected to be used for tools or ground for fertilizer. The hierarchy extended to food, and everyone understood their place in the distribution. The palace rooms on the upper levels opened onto balconies and terraces that overlooked the city and lake. Imagine yourself standing on one such terrace in the late afternoon, when the sun has softened and the air carries a slight coolness from the water. Below, the city spreads in geometric order. The straight lines of causeways, the grid of canals, the rectangular plots of chinampas stretching to the horizon. You can see the farmers poling their canoes, tiny figures moving with patient rhythm. You can see smoke rising from countless cooking fires, thin columns that gather and disperse in the light wind. The market at Tlatelolco is a distant buzz, a sense of movement more than specific detail. The lake holds the sky's color, shifts from blue to silver as your angle of view changes. Near the palace, ornamental gardens are arranged with careful thought, flowering shrubs that release scent in the evening, fruit trees pruned to precise shapes, medicinal plants kept in raised beds. There are fountains fed by aqueduct water from Chapultepec, their gentle splash a constant companion to conversation. Birds move through these gardens, orioles bright as flames, thrushes with their melodious calls, hummingbirds that hang in air as if suspended by invisible threads. From this height, the empire's fragility is not visible. You cannot see the tribute collectors on distant roads, the resentments nursed in subject cities, the diseases that will arrive with Spanish ships. What you see is order, beauty, the successful transformation of a marshy lake into a place of power and grace. It is a view that invites satisfaction, a sense that human effort and divine favor have combined to create something lasting. The nobles who lived in the palace knew this view intimately. It was the backdrop to their conversations, their negotiations, their quiet moments of rest. Some perhaps took it for granted. Others might have paused occasionally to feel the strangeness of it, that they stood here in comfort while others bent to fieldwork or carried burdens along the causeways. The hierarchy was not questioned, not in any systematic way. It was the structure of the world, as natural as the lake itself, as inevitable as sunrise. To live near the emperor was to live within a web of rules so dense they formed a kind of atmosphere. Every gesture, every word, every movement through space was governed by protocols that had accumulated over generations, layer upon layer of meaning and restriction. When a noble entered the emperor's presence, he removed his sandals if he wore them, a mark of humility. He lowered his gaze, not looking directly at the ruler's face. He approached slowly, without sudden movements. If he carried a petition or report, it was presented through an intermediary, passed hand to hand until it reached the proper official, who would then convey it to the emperor. Direct address was rare. Most communication was filtered through layers of courtesy and indirection. The emperor himself moved within even stricter bounds. He did not walk on ground that others had walked on without the path first being swept. When he did walk, attendants preceded him, marking his passage. He did not dress himself. Robbing was a ritual performed by trained attendants who knew the order of garments, the proper draping of cloaks, the correct placement of jewelry. He did not serve himself food or drink. He spoke rarely in public, and when he did, his words were received as pronouncements, recorded by scribes, remembered and repeated. This was not merely ceremony for its own sake. It was a system of power made visible, a way of maintaining distance between the human and the divine office. The emperor was Huey Tlatoni, the great speaker, but he was also understood to hold a portion of divinity, to serve as intermediary between the human realm and the gods. The elaborate etiquette created a buffer, a space that protected both the ruler and those around him from the dangerous proximity of such concentrated power. For those who served in the palace, learning these rules was essential. A mistake could mean disgrace. To speak out of turn, to look too directly, to touch what should not be touched. These were not mere breaches of politeness, but violations of cosmic order. Yet the rules also provided security. If you knew your place and performed it correctly, you were safe. The structure held you. The palace housed the emperor's children and those of high nobles, raised together in an atmosphere of training and observation. These were not childhoods of play and freedom. They were apprenticeships in power. Boys learned warfare, not just the techniques of combat, but the strategies of command, the reading of omens, the conduct expected of a warrior noble. They learned the calendar systems, the 260-day ritual cycle and the 365-day solar year, and how these interlocked to mark favorable and unfavorable days for action. They learned rhetoric, the formal speech patterns used in councils, the metaphors and paired phrases that marked educated discourse. They practiced with weapons in courtyards, their movements supervised by veteran warriors who corrected stance and praised precision. Girls learned textile arts, the creation of cloth that was both commodity and symbol. They learned to manage households, to direct servants, to prepare the special foods required for ceremonies. They learned songs and dances performed at festivals. They were taught the medicinal uses of plants, the prayers appropriate for different occasions, the complex negotiations of marriage alliances that would one day be their responsibility to maintain. All of them learned by watching. They observed councils, standing silently at the margins. They attended ceremonies, learning through repetition the order of events, the correct postures, the moments of silence, and the moments of sound. They absorbed the hierarchy by living within it, understanding viscerally who deferred to whom, who spoke first, who entered rooms in what order. It was an education that produced competence, but also a kind of narrowness. The children of the palace knew their world intimately, but had little direct experience of others. The farmers on the chinampas, the merchants on the roads, the common people in their neighborhoods. These were known through reports and at a distance. The palace children learned to command, but not necessarily to understand. Privilege comes with its own burdens, less visible but no less real. The nobles who lived in the palace were watched constantly, their behavior a reflection on their lineage and their loyalty. A misstep could cost not just personal standing, but could stain an entire family line. The pressure to perform correctly was constant and subtle. Like a weight carried so long, it becomes part of the body's posture. Marriages were arranged for political advantage, not personal affection. A noble woman might be sent to a distant city to cement an alliance, leaving behind family and familiar places, entering a household where she would be watched and judged. A nobleman might take wives from multiple lineages, managing not just domestic affairs, but complex webs of obligation and precedence among his spouses and their families. The luxuries, the fine foods, the feathered cloaks, the spacious rooms were real, but they came with the expectation of display. Wealth was not to be hoarded privately, but shown, shared at feasts, given in gifts, circulated through the networks that maintained alliances. A noble who accumulated without distributing was seen as miserly, as failing in the responsibilities that justified his privileges. And there was the proximity to violence, both ritualized and practical. High nobles participated in ceremonies that involved human sacrifice. They witnessed death presented as duty. They understood that warfare was not an occasional crisis, but a constant requirement, that the empire's stability depended on demonstrating strength, on taking captives, on maintaining the ritual cycles that kept the cosmos in motion. This knowledge was not hidden or softened. It was part of the world they inhabited, as present as the smell of copal smoke or the taste of chocolate. If you stood on that terrace overlooking the city and lake, knowing what we know now, that within a generation this entire world would be shattered, that the causeways would run with blood and then fall silent, that the palace would be torn down and its stones used to build churches, that the language would persist, but the structures of power would be replaced, you might see the scene differently. The beauty would remain, but it would be touched with sadness, with the knowledge of impermanence. But those who lived there did not know. They lived as people always live, assuming that tomorrow would resemble today, that the structures that held them were solid enough to last. They worried about immediate things, the proper conduct of a ceremony, the management of a household, the negotiation of a marriage, the maintenance of position within the hierarchy. They did not imagine that men would arrive from across the ocean, that diseases would sweep through populations with a speed that felt like divine punishment, that their gods would be declared false and their temples destroyed. The palace life, with all its beauty and order, was built on foundations that were more fragile than they appeared. It depended on the continued flow of tribute, which depended on the empire's military strength, which depended on alliances and subjugations that were never fully stable. It depended on a shared framework of meaning, gods, rituals, cosmology, that gave purpose and justification to the elaborate hierarchy. When that framework was challenged, when a different worldview arrived, backed by weapons and diseases and certainty, the entire structure proved vulnerable. But for those who lived within it, day to day, the palace was simply the world, as real and as solid as the stones beneath their feet. As the sun sets and the light over the lake turns from gold to rose to purple, the palace settles into its evening rhythms. Lamps are lit, clay vessels filled with oil, wicks floating, flames small and steady. The smell of smoke mixes with the last warmth of the day. In the courtyards, nobles gather for conversation, their voices low, their silhouettes dark against the fading sky. In the great hall, preparations are made for a feast. Mats are laid in careful order, dishes are arranged. Musicians arrive with their instruments, drums of various sizes, clay flutes, rattles made from gourds, the haunting sound of conch-shell trumpets that carry across distances. Dancers check their costumes, adjusting feathered headdresses, tying anklets with shells that will mark rhythm as they move. The emperor appears, and the room shifts its attention without obvious gesture. He takes his place on a raised platform, attended closely. The feast begins, courses brought in succession, each announced, each received with formal appreciation. Chocolate is served in tall cups painted with glyphs, the foam carefully prepared, the liquid rich and slightly bitter. Between courses, entertainment, a dance telling the story of a legendary battle, the movements stylized, the costumes catching lamplight. Conversation continues at lower levels of the hierarchy, nobles discussing matters of trade and tribute, marriages and lineage, the prospects for next season's campaigns. Scribes sit at the margins, their painted books open, recording important declarations for future reference. Servants move efficiently, anticipating needs, replacing empty vessels, adjusting lamps as the night deepens. Later, when the feast concludes and the nobles return to their quarters, the palace grows quieter. Guards remain at their posts. A few lamps continue to burn in corridors. The city beyond the walls is not silent. There are always sounds, distant and close, the living noises of a place where 200,000 people sleep and wake and go about their business. But within the palace, the noise is muted. The emperor retires to his private chambers, where attendants help him remove the layers of formal dress. The feathered cloak is carefully folded. The jewelry is stored. He washes in scented water, dries with soft cloth, and lies on a mat covered with fine cotton. Around him, the palace holds its breath, holds him, a man alone within structures built to magnify and isolate him at once. And if he sleeps, perhaps he dreams of the lake, of the chinampas stretching to the horizon, of the empire's edges sending their tribute inward like rivers flowing to the sea. Or perhaps he dreams of nothing, the sleep of exhaustion, the brief escape from the weight of office and obligation. Morning will come as it always does. The city will wake. The farmers will take to their canoes, the poles tapping softly against lake beds. The market will begin to hum with commerce. The palace will resume its rhythms, councils, ceremonies, the constant work of maintaining an empire. The sun will rise over mountains to the east, and its light will fall on the temple pyramids, on the city's white buildings, on the lake surface, on the chinampas, with their green rows of growing things. For now, let yourself rest in the knowledge of this pattern, this rhythm of their lives that continued for decades, for centuries, until the day it did not. The palace, with all its beauty and burden, its feathers and protocols and distant views, was a human creation, as fragile and as remarkable as any human creation must be. And as you drift towards sleep yourself, here in the comfort of your own time, your own place, perhaps you can hold both thoughts together, the wonder of what was built and the inevitability of its ending. Neither cancels the other. The palace existed. The people lived, the feathers caught light, the chocolate was drunk, the children learned, the farmers worked. And then the world changed as worlds do. But that is for history to record. For now, let the lamplight fade. Let the distant sounds soften, and let the palace rest as you rest, held in the embrace of deep night and deeper time. We have traveled together through many hours now, from the early morning on the chinampas to the palace's evening lamplight. We have watched farmers tend their floating gardens, felt the weight of tribute carried in cacao beans, stood at a distance from ceremonies that promised cosmic balance. We have traced the path of an emperor whose confidence could not save him from misunderstanding and captivity. We have examined objects of crystal that promised ancient mystery but delivered modern craft. And we have walked the palace corridors, where privilege was performed with elaborate care, where feathers were worth more than houses, and where the view from the terrace suggested permanence that history would not grant. The rhythm of their lives was steady and complex, woven from necessity and ceremony, from the practical work of feeding a city and the symbolic work of maintaining cosmic order. It was a world that made sense on its own terms, that held together through shared understanding and constant effort, that produced beauty and demanded sacrifice in measures we can observe but not fully feel. As you lie in your own comfortable bed, far from marshes and canals, far from tribute demands and ceremonial protocols, you can appreciate the distance that time has created. The Aztec Empire fell. The city was rebuilt as Mexico City. The lake was drained. The chinampas, some of them remain. You can visit them in Xochimilco, watch farmers work in ways not entirely different from their ancestors, see the willows and the narrow plots and the patient rhythm that persists even when the larger structures have changed. The people too persist, Nahuatl is still spoken. Descendants of those farmers and nobles and priests walk the streets of modern cities, carry the genetic and cultural inheritance of that world forward, adapted and transformed, but not erased. The past is not truly past. It is layered beneath the present, visible if you know where to look, audible if you listen carefully. But for now, those layers can settle like silt, can rest undisturbed in the quiet of your mind. You do not need to carry empire or tribute or cosmic responsibility. You do not need to watch for omens or measure your words against elaborate protocols. You can simply breathe, let your body relax into the support beneath you, and allow the images and stories to drift away like smoke from a distant fire. The night is here, and it is kind. The morning will bring its own tasks and its own rhythms, but they are not yet arrived. You have time, all the time you need, to rest, to sleep, to let the day's efforts fade into the comfortable darkness. And if you wake in the night, briefly, remember, you are safe. The world you inhabit, for all its challenges, does not demand cacao tribute or fear of selection for sacrifice. The farmers work their fields, but you are not required to dredge canals or reinforce banks against flooding. The palaces of power exist, but you are not burdened with their protocols. You are simply here, breathing quietly, held by the present moment. The Aztecs built their city on water, a remarkable and precarious act of faith and engineering. You are building your rest on the foundation of this quiet night, and that is enough. Let the stories we have shared become a gentle current that carries you towards sleep, and know that when you wake, they will have settled, become part of the quiet knowledge you carry, no longer demanding attention, but simply there, like the memory of a long walk through an unfamiliar but beautiful place. Sleep well. The Chinampas are still, the palace is dark, the lake holds the night sky, and you are here, safe and still, drifting gently toward dreams that need no interpretation, toward rest that requires no ceremony. Good night.